The sun was dipping low over the wide plains near Antioch, casting a warm, reddish glow across the sandy ground, almost like it was painting the scene for what was about to happen. Picture this: two groups of Roman soldiers facing off, not over some faraway territory or personal honors, but over the future direction of their whole empire. On one side, you had Emperor Macrinus, a guy who stepped into power almost by accident, someone more at home with plans and strategies than grand adventures. And opposing him, a young teenager named Elagabalus, full of passion and drive, with his troops guided by a smart general called Gannys. It was a moment where everything hung in the balance: hopes, loyalties, and the path ahead for Rome. This clash at Antioch happened on the 8th of June in the year 218 after Christ, and it wasn't just any fight. It marked the start of a new chapter for one of Rome's most talked-about leaders. Here were two visions for the empire: Macrinus offering steady, thoughtful guidance, while Elagabalus brought a fresh, almost spiritual energy, drawing people in with his background as a priest of the sun god. The one who came out on top would shape Rome's story, while the other would fade into the background. It's amazing to think how personal choices and family ties could sway something so huge. Before we dive deeper into how it all unfolded, if you're enjoying this tale, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and turn on notifications. Stories like this from the past really do light up our understanding of today. Picture Rome in the year 217 after Christ. The empire was reeling, wounded not by foreign invaders, but by its own leader. Emperor Caracalla had ruled with an iron fist, and his reign had left deep scars across the Roman world. Then, suddenly he was gone, struck down by an assassin's blade while traveling in the east. The question on everyone's lips was simple but dangerous. Who had ordered his death? Enter Macrinus. He wasn't your typical Roman emperor, not by a long shot. This man had never commanded legions in battle or descended from ancient patrician families. He was a lawyer, an administrator, someone who understood documents and decrees far better than he understood the hearts of soldiers. When the Senate reluctantly placed the purple cloak on his shoulders, many whispered that he had orchestrated Caracalla's murder to seize power. Whether true or not, the rumor spread like wildfire through the military camps. The legions, those battle-hardened men who were the backbone of Roman power, didn't trust him. They grumbled around their campfires, wondering if this cautious, calculating man could truly lead Rome. Macrinus sensed their doubt, and it made him hesitant, always looking over his shoulder. But while Macrinus worried in Rome, something extraordinary was happening in Syria. There, in the ancient city of Emesa, a grandmother named Julia Maesa was making moves that would shake the empire to its foundations. She had been part of the imperial family under Caracalla, and she refused to fade into obscurity. She had a secret weapon, her 14-year-old grandson. His name was Elagabalus, though some called him Elagabalus, after the sun god he served. Imagine a teenager, barely old enough to grow a beard, dressed in the flowing robes of a high priest. He spent his days performing ancient rituals in the temple, dancing before the sacred black stone that represented the divine sun. To the people of Syria, he wasn't just a boy. He was touched by the gods themselves. Julia Maesa was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. She spread a story that seemed almost too perfect. Elagabalus was actually the illegitimate son of Caracalla, making him the rightful heir to the throne. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was that people believed it, or wanted to believe it. The eastern provinces, proud of their own traditions and tired of being ruled by distant Romans, rallied to the young priest-king. The contrast between these two men couldn't have been sharper. On one side stood Macrinus, middle-aged, careful, a man who thought through every decision 10 times before acting. He wore his purple robes like a burden, always aware of how precarious his position was. On the other side stood Elagabalus, young, radiant with religious fervor, convinced that destiny and the gods themselves had chosen him. Where Macrinus calculated, Elagabalus inspired. Where Macrinus hesitated, Elagabalus burned with certainty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide Rome's future. Two visions of empire, two very different leaders, and between them, the loyalty of thousands of armed men who would have to choose which version of Rome they wanted to fight for. The empire held its breath, waiting to see which path would prevail, the careful pragmatism of a lawyer emperor, or the blazing conviction of a teenage priest who claimed the favor of heaven itself. Rome's fate truly did hang in the balance, suspended between two worlds, two futures, waiting for the clash that would decide everything. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Behind the young Elagabalus stood a man who would actually command the rebel forces, a general named Gannys. Now, Gannys is one of history's most intriguing figures, and here's why. He was a eunuch who had never received formal military training. He came from the imperial household, not from the ranks of seasoned commanders. Yet this man, who by all traditional Roman standards should never have led an army, was about to do exactly that. Gannys understood something fundamental. This wasn't really about military genius. It was about momentum, about belief, about channeling the energy of thousands of men who wanted change. He knew how to read people, how to keep morale high, how to make soldiers feel like they were part of something larger than themselves. In the dusty camps of Syria, as men sharpened their swords and checked their armor, Gannys moved among them, speaking of destiny and divine favor. The young priest king Elagabalus might have been the symbol, but Gannys was the engine driving the rebellion forward. Meanwhile, Macrinus sat in his headquarters, receiving reports that should have alarmed him. Legion after legion in the east was declaring for the boy. Cities were opening their gates to Elagabalus without resistance. The common soldiers, who had loved Caracalla despite his cruelty, believed the story that this teenager was his son. Yet Macrinus hesitated. This hesitation reveals something deeply human about him. He was a careful man in a situation that demanded boldness. Perhaps he thought the whole thing would collapse on its own. After all, how could a 14-year-old and an untrained general truly threaten the might of Rome? Perhaps he underestimated the power of religious fervor in the eastern provinces. Or perhaps deep down he knew his own support was shaky and feared that acting too aggressively might cause his own troops to question their loyalty. Whatever the reason, Macrinus waited. He gathered intelligence, he consulted advisors, he weighed options. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Elagabalus's army grew stronger, more confident, more convinced of their inevitable victory. This pattern plays out repeatedly throughout history. Leaders who mistake caution for wisdom, who confuse delay with strategy. Macrinus wanted to be sure, wanted to have all the information before committing. But in times of crisis, hesitation itself becomes a decision, and often the worst one possible. By the time Macrinus finally mobilized his forces to march east and confront the rebellion, Gannys had already secured much of Syria. The rebel army was battle-ready, their spirits high, singing hymns to the sun god as they marched. They believed they were on the right side of history, that the divine itself marched with them. Think about what you value in leadership: decisive action or careful deliberation? Who do you think deserved the throne in this moment? If you're finding this journey through ancient Rome as fascinating as we do, share this with fellow history lovers and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. These stories from the past still echo in our present, teaching us about human nature, power, and the choices that change everything. The two armies were now on a collision course, marching toward each other across the hot Syrian landscape. The fate of the Roman Empire would soon be decided not in the halls of the Senate, but on a dusty plain near the ancient city of Antioch. The moment of truth was approaching, and there would be no more time for hesitation. Let me tell you about one of the most dramatic moments in Roman history, a battle that lasted just a single day but changed everything. The date was the 8th of June, in the year 218 after Christ, and as the sun rose over the plains near Antioch, two Roman armies faced each other, ready to decide the fate of an empire. Imagine the scene that morning. The air was already thick with heat, that oppressive Syrian summer warmth that makes every movement feel like wading through water. Thousands of soldiers stood in formation, their armor catching the early light, shields forming walls of painted wood and bronze. But something was different about these armies. This wasn't the usual disciplined confidence you'd expect from Roman legions. On one side, you could almost feel the doubt hanging over Macrinus's troops like a cloud. These men were exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. They'd been marching for weeks under an emperor many of them didn't quite believe in. Remember, Macrinus was the lawyer who'd somehow ended up wearing the purple cloak, the administrator who'd never really earned the soldiers' trust. Around their campfires the night before, you can imagine the whispered conversations. Should they really be fighting for this man? Was he even the legitimate emperor? Some of them had served under Caracalla and believed the rumors that the boy on the other side was Caracalla's true son. And speaking of the other side, what a contrast. Elagabalus's army practically vibrated with energy. These weren't just soldiers. They were believers. Many of them had watched the young priest perform his sacred rituals, had seen him dance before the holy stone in his flowing robes, had heard the promises that the sun god himself had chosen this boy to rule Rome. They sang hymns as they prepared for battle, their voices carrying across the dusty plain. It didn't matter that their commander, Gannys, had never formally studied warfare. They believed they were on the right side of history. That divine favor would guide their swords. As the two forces finally moved toward each other, you could hear the sound that every ancient soldier knew meant battle was beginning. The rhythmic thud of thousands of sandaled feet marching in unison, the metallic scraping of swords being drawn from their sheaths, the creaking of leather straps on shields and armor. Then came the moment of impact, that terrible collision when two walls of men and metal crashed together. The fighting was fierce, but it wasn't the tactical masterpiece you might expect from a Roman battle. This was messier, more desperate. Gannys, despite his lack of formal training, understood something crucial. He didn't need to outmaneuver Macrinus. He just needed to hold firm and let the emperor's own weaknesses do the work. And those weaknesses were becoming more obvious by the hour. You see, confidence is a strange thing in battle. It spreads through an army like fire through dry grass. When soldiers believe they're going to win, they fight with a ferocity that's hard to match. When they doubt their cause, that hesitation shows in every sword stroke, every defensive formation. Macrinus's troops were already questioning their loyalty, already wondering if they were on the wrong side. And Gannys exploited that brilliantly. The general pushed his forces forward at key moments, not with sophisticated maneuvers, but with raw determination. Every time Macrinus's lines wavered, Gannys's zealots pressed harder. They shouted the name of their young priest king, called on the power of the sun god, reminded everyone within earshot that they were fighting for Caracalla's rightful heir. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat. Picture the chaos of close combat. Men grappling with each other, shields being shoved against shields, the metallic ring of bronze swords striking armor, the shouts of commanders trying to maintain order, the groans of the wounded. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet made it hard to see more than a few paces ahead. In that confusion, something started to happen that Macrinus must have feared from the beginning. His soldiers began to break. Not all at once. It never happens that way. First, a few men at the edges of the formation started stepping back. Then small groups began laying down their weapons. Some actually turned and walked toward Elagabalus's lines, ready to switch sides right there on the battlefield. The Praetorian Guards, those elite soldiers who were supposed to be the emperor's most loyal defenders, looked at each other and made a calculation. Why die for a man nobody really believed in when they could join the winning side and probably get rewarded for it? For Macrinus, watching from his command position, this must have been absolutely terrifying. All his careful planning, all his cautious strategy, none of it mattered now. He'd thought he could control events through deliberation and wisdom, but in the end, he'd simply waited too long and believed too little in his own cause. The battle wasn't just being lost through military defeat. It was collapsing from within as his own men decided they'd rather not be on his side anymore. Gannys, meanwhile, must have been almost surprised by how well things were going. He kept his forces pressing forward, maintained their discipline even in the heat and chaos, and most importantly, kept that sense of divine purpose alive. His soldiers believed they couldn't lose, and that belief was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. By afternoon, As the sun reached its peak and the heat became almost unbearable, the outcome was clear. Macrinus's army hadn't just been defeated, it had essentially dissolved. The emperor himself, seeing everything crumbling around him, made the only choice he had left. He fled the battlefield, leaving his purple cloak and his throne behind. Imagine the indignity of it. The ruler of the Roman Empire, running for his life across the Syrian landscape, knowing that every step took him further from power and closer to the death that surely awaited him. The interesting thing about this battle is what it reveals about power itself. Macrinus had every traditional advantage. He held the throne. He had the backing of Rome. He commanded what should have been superior forces. But he lacked the one thing that truly mattered: the belief of his own soldiers. Elagabalus and Gannys, on the other hand, had almost nothing except that belief, that sense of righteous purpose, that conviction that they were meant to win. And in the end, that intangible quality proved more powerful than all of Macrinus's careful calculations. The Battle of Antioch wasn't the longest or the bloodiest in Roman history, but it was one of the most significant. It showed that sometimes, in moments of crisis, people don't follow logic or tradition. They follow whoever makes them believe in something larger than themselves. It demonstrated that an inexperienced commander with passionate troops could defeat a seasoned emperor with doubtful ones. And it proved that 14-year-old boys, if they had the right support and the right story, could actually seize control of the mightiest empire in the world. As the sun set on that 8th of June, the young priest Elagabalus stood victorious on the field where his destiny had been decided. Within days, he would enter Antioch in triumph and be crowned Emperor of Rome. Macrinus would be hunted down and executed, his brief reign erased from official records as if he'd never been. The Roman Empire had traded stability for spectacle, caution for passion, experience for youth and religious fervor. And Rome, as the young emperor's supporters had promised, would indeed never be the same. There's a moment in every collapse when you can see it all falling apart, when the carefully built structure just starts crumbling and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. For Emperor Macrinus, that moment came in the middle of the battle, when he realized his own soldiers were abandoning him. Think about what that must have felt like. You're standing there, supposedly the most powerful man in the world, commanding legions that have conquered nations and built an empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Arabia. And then you look around and see your own troops, men who swore oaths to protect you, who ate your bread and took your gold, walking away, not running in panic, not even being defeated in honest combat, just leaving. The Praetorian Guards were the first to make their move, and that's particularly significant. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The Praetorians were the emperor's personal bodyguards, the elite unit that was supposed to stand by the ruler no matter what. They lived in Rome, they received double the pay of regular legionaries, and their entire identity was built around being the emperor's most loyal defenders. But loyalty, as it turns out, has a price. Elagabalus's supporters had been clever about this. In the days and weeks leading up to the battle, messengers had been moving through the camps, making promises. Gold, of course. Everyone understands gold. But also glory, positions of honor, the chance to be on the winning side of history. They reminded the Praetorians that this boy claimed to be Caracalla's son, and many of these same guards had served under Caracalla. Wouldn't it be better, the whispers suggested, to serve the true heir rather than the uncertain lawyer who'd somehow stumbled into power? During the battle itself, as the fighting raged and the dust swirled, small groups of Praetorians began to step back from the front lines. At first, it might have looked like they were regrouping or repositioning, but then they started removing their helmets, the universal signal that they were done fighting. Some even began calling out to the other side, announcing they were switching their allegiance. Imagine being Macrinus in that moment. Every emperor's nightmare is betrayal by the Praetorians. They were the unit that had murdered emperors before, that had literally auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder just a few generations earlier. And now, in the middle of a battle that would decide everything, they were choosing the other side. The thing about military defections is that they spread like a contagion. Once one unit breaks ranks, others start questioning why they're still fighting. If the elite Praetorians don't believe in the emperor anymore, Why should regular legionaries risk their lives? Soldiers started looking at each other, having those quick, silent conversations that happen with just eye contact and slight nods. Should we keep going? Is this worth dying for? The answer, for more and more of them, was no. Groups of men began laying down their shields. Some dropped their swords. Others simply turned and walked toward Elagabalus's lines, hands raised to show they meant no harm. The rebel forces welcomed them. This was exactly what they'd been hoping for. Why waste energy fighting when your enemy's army would just join you instead? For the commanders still trying to keep Macrinus's forces together, this must have been maddening. They'd shout orders, trying to maintain formation, but their voices were increasingly ignored. Military discipline, that iron structure that held Roman armies together, was dissolving right before their eyes. It wasn't a rout where men flee in terror. It was something almost more disturbing, a calm, deliberate decision by thousands of soldiers that they simply weren't going to fight anymore. Macrinus, watching his army melt away, faced an agonizing choice. He could stay and try to rally his remaining loyal troops, maybe even fight to the death like a proper Roman emperor should. Or he could accept reality and try to save his own life. It's easy to judge from centuries away, to say what he should have done. But imagine standing there, probably in your 40s or 50s, never having been a soldier at heart, watching everything you'd worked for collapse around you. The throne you'd held for barely a year, slipping away in a single afternoon. He chose survival. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Macrinus stripped off the symbols of his office, the purple cloak that marked him as emperor, the ceremonial armor. He mounted a horse and rode away from the battle, surrounded by a small group of still loyal attendants. Behind him, the sounds of fighting were already dying down, replaced by the cheers of Elagabalus's victorious troops. Here's what's haunting about that flight. Macrinus must have known he was only delaying the inevitable. Where could a former emperor run to in the Roman Empire? Every province, every city would soon hear about his defeat. He was, as people sometimes say, a dead man walking, still breathing, still moving, but with his fate already sealed. The journey that followed must have been surreal. Riding through the Syrian countryside, probably traveling at night to avoid detection, constantly looking over his shoulder. Every stranger on the road could be a bounty hunter. Every distant sound of horses could be pursuers. The man who'd woken up that morning as Emperor of Rome went to sleep as a fugitive, if he could sleep at all. It took about a month, but they caught him eventually. Macrinus tried to disguise himself, tried to blend in with ordinary travelers, but you can't hide an ex-emperor for long. When news of his capture reached Elagabalus's camp, the young emperor showed no mercy. Macrinus was executed, his brief reign officially erased from the records as if it had never happened. His son, who'd been named co-emperor, met the same fate. The betrayal and collapse at Antioch teaches us something profound about power and loyalty. Macrinus had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd thought that holding the throne was enough, that the title itself would command loyalty. But titles are just words. Real power comes from belief, from making people want to follow you rather than feeling obligated to. The Praetorians and the other defecting soldiers weren't being cowardly. In their minds, they were making a rational choice. Why fight for an emperor nobody believed in, against a cause that seemed touched by divine favor? Why die for uncertainty when the other side offered confidence and reward? From their perspective, switching sides wasn't betrayal. It was recognizing reality. This pattern appears throughout history, in empires and kingdoms and governments of all kinds. Leaders fall not because they're defeated in honest battle, but because their own people decide to stop supporting them. The collapse happens from within, through 1,000 individual decisions by ordinary people who simply choose to walk away. And that's perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. That power, no matter how mighty it seems, is always just one mass defection away from disappearing completely. The emperor stands alone only when people decide to stand with him. Take that away, and he's just another man, running through the desert, hoping to survive one more day. So here we are, at the end of this incredible journey. Picture the scene. a dusty battlefield outside Antioch on that 8th day of June in the year 218 after Christ. And standing in the middle of it all is a 14-year-old boy who has just won an empire. Let me tell you, there's something almost surreal about that image. Elagabalus, this teenager who just hours before had been watching his troops fight for his claim to the throne, now stood as the undisputed ruler of the Roman world. Think about what you were doing at 14. Maybe worrying about school, spending time with friends, figuring out who you were. This young man was being proclaimed Emperor of Rome, the most powerful position on earth at that time. The entry into Antioch must have been something to witness. The city gates swung open, and in came the victorious army, not with the usual Roman military precision, but with something different, a religious fervor that was almost electric. At the front of this procession was Elagabalus himself, still wearing his priestly robes, those flowing garments that marked him as a servant of the sun god. The people of Antioch lined the streets, some cheering, some simply stunned by what they were seeing. This wasn't the typical Roman triumph. It was something older, something that connected to the ancient traditions of the East. Within days of entering the city, the formal coronation took place. Imagine the ceremony. Roman officials who'd served under Macrinus just weeks before, now kneeling before a teenager, placing the purple cloak on his shoulders, pronouncing him Augustus, supreme ruler of the empire. Some of them must have been thinking about how quickly fortunes could change, how a single battle could transform everything. But here's what makes this moment so significant. Rome really would never be the same after this. The empire had seen young emperors before, sure. It had seen unconventional rulers, but Elagabalus represented something fundamentally different. He wasn't just young. He was bringing with him a whole different worldview, an Eastern religious perspective that would clash dramatically with Roman traditions. The story of Macrinus's end is particularly sobering. Remember, this was a man who'd been emperor, who'd worn the purple, who'd commanded legions. After fleeing the battlefield, he spent about a month as a fugitive, constantly moving, always looking over his shoulder. When they finally caught him, probably somewhere in Asia Minor, there was no mercy, no trial, no chance to make his case. The execution was swift and final. What's particularly harsh is how they treated his memory afterward. In Rome, they had this practice called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. They literally tried to erase Macrinus from history. His name was chiseled off monuments. His coins were melted down. Official records were rewritten as if his reign had never happened. It's a uniquely Roman form of punishment, not just to take someone's life, but to try to take their place in history too. And here's something worth pausing on. The document mentions that this was more than just a battle. It was the moment Rome traded stability for spectacle. That's a really profound observation, and it captures something essential about what happened next. Macrinus, for all his flaws, represented a kind of careful, administrative approach to ruling. He was cautious, methodical, someone who thought things through. Elagabalus represented the opposite: passion, religious fervor, youth, unpredictability. Now, I need to be careful here because we're talking about wisdom and power, and the relationship between them. The lesson being offered is that power without wisdom can be dangerous, that it cuts both ways. And if you look at what happened in the years following this battle, there's truth to that. Elagabalus's reign was short and troubled. His religious reforms upset traditional Romans. His youth and inexperience showed in his decisions. Within just a few years, he too would meet a violent end, proving that winning power and keeping it are very different challenges. But here's what's fascinating about this whole story. It shows us how fragile political power really is, how much it depends on belief and perception rather than any inherent right or strength. Macrinus had the throne, the title, the theoretical authority. But when people stopped believing in him, when his soldiers decided they'd rather follow a 14-year-old priest, all that authority evaporated like morning dew in the Syrian sun. The Battle of Antioch teaches us something timeless about human nature and how societies work. It shows us that in moments of crisis, people don't necessarily follow logic or tradition. They follow whoever makes them feel something, whoever gives them a story to believe in, whoever seems to offer certainty in uncertain times. Elagabalus and his grandmother Julia Maesa understood that. They gave people a narrative, the rightful heir returning, the gods choosing their champion, destiny unfolding as it should. Whether that story was true didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that people wanted it to be true. If this tale of ambition and betrayal gripped you, smash that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, for history's echoes must never fade. And you know what? We can see echoes of this throughout history, right up to the present day. Political movements, social changes, shifts in power. They often happen not because of careful planning or superior force, but because one side manages to capture people's imagination and belief in a way the other side doesn't. The Battle of Antioch was decided as much in the hearts and minds of those soldiers as it was by any tactical brilliance on the battlefield. So as we step back from this ancient drama, what stays with us? Maybe it's the image of that teenage emperor standing in triumph while knowing that the same forces that brought him to power could just as easily destroy him. Maybe it's the lesson about how quickly everything can change, how a single day can reshape an empire. Or maybe it's the reminder that throughout history, the most interesting moments are often when things are most unstable, when the future is genuinely uncertain and could go in multiple directions. The story of Elagabalus's victory at Antioch is ultimately a story about ambition, belief, timing, and the strange ways that history unfolds. It's about a grandmother who refused to fade into obscurity, a general who succeeded despite never being trained for war, a boy who became emperor, and a careful man who lost everything because he hesitated at the wrong moment. Rome traded stability for spectacle that day, and the empire would spend years dealing with the consequences. But that moment outside Antioch, when a 14-year-old priest-king won a throne, that moment still speaks to us across the centuries, reminding us that power is always more fragile than it appears, and that belief can move mountains, or at least change empires.